13 men around a table, 13 men about to eat. There's the basin. Where's the servant? 13 men have dusty feet. Thomas, closest to the basin, quickly chooses not to budge. Next year's military genius can't be this year's common drudge. Cleaning dirt from people's toenails nauseates Thaddeus, who nods at James and then at the basin. James misapprehends his cue. Cloak and dagger Chief Nathaniel rises, drops back in his seat. What a blot upon his record. This man's good at washing feet. James the Lesser squirms and reddens. Judas stares beyond the doors. Talented administrators should not stoop to lowly chores. Peter calls a cabinet meeting. Philip's overcome with heat. 12 men yawn and scratch and wonder, who is going to wash our feet? Chancellor and lordly bishop, minister and admiral, plutocrats snap to attention. Jesus stands before them all. Jesus Christ, their Lord and Master, friend of sinners, Son of Man, Son of God, God's own Messiah, seizes up the water pan. With one hand, he takes the towel, tucks it in his belt, and then rolls his sleeves above his elbows. Walks by 12 astonished men, pours some water in the basin, puts the basin on the tile. Next to open-mouthed Thaddeus, takes his sandal with a smile, dips his feet into the water, washes well between his toes, pats them dry, refills the basin, tucks the towel again, and goes. Andrew, Thomas, John, and Judas, Simon and Bartholomew, James the Greater, James the Lesser, Matthew's turn, and Philip's too. All their feet are washed. But Peter's? Jesus takes the basin now, moves near Peter, kneels beside him. Peter jumps. I can't allow peon labor, chore of servant, slave work to be done for me by my teacher, Lord, and Master. Go away and let me be. Dirty feet I've seen quite often. Dirty feet I washed before. If you let me use that basin, I can wash my feet once more. Peter grabs, but Jesus dodges. Peter, listen, for my sake. Here's a lesson you must study. When to give and when to take. Give your all, but not for glory. Give as long as there is need. As a servant in my kingdom, you can plant the gospel seed. Take from me the right to enter heaven's kingdom, come to earth. Wash your soul in heaven's fountain. Take from me the second birth. Jesus sets aside the basin. Peter clutches him in dread. Master, stay and wash me fully. Wash my feet, my hands, my head. Kneeling, Jesus washes Peter, a woe-begone fisher of men. One who's bathed is clean, says Jesus, when just his feet are washed again. I, your master, played the servant. Each of you should do the same. Servant all, servant one another, when you gather in my name. 13 men around a table, one alone is devil-led. 12 men, clean in soul and body, ready now for wine and bread. Matthew doesn't broach the question. Luke is silent, as is Mark. Likewise, John forgets to mention. Scholars thus are in the dark. Who washed Jesus' feet? Frida, this looks like a good day to plant those seeds, my husband John said as he left for his barber shop. That afternoon, in the sunshine's warmth, I knelt in the garden planting sweet pea seeds. It was Good Friday and the hour when most people in town were at church. I was still recovering from a serious operation. The doctor didn't think I would walk again. I could only get around with the aid of a walker, and I felt slow, awkward, frustrated. My recovery seemed far away. Why Good Friday, I wondered. For Jesus, it had been a day of sadness, pain. Crawling slowly on my knees, I poked a finger into the earth, dropped in a seed, then covered it. Soon shoots will be popping through the spring snow, I told myself. I pictured them, could almost smell their fragrance. In my garden, I felt very near to God. I thought of Christ praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. And as I struggled on my knees, my thoughts traveled with Jesus to his trial, then to Golgotha, where he suffered on the cross. I remembered his cry, "It is finished." I too had suffered, had lingered near death after brain surgery. Only my faith and my family had sustained me. Working in the soil, I felt at peace and strengthened. Tucking in the last seed, I stood and gazed proudly at my neat row. Well, it's finished. My thoughts remained on Good Friday as I walked to the house. At the porch, I glanced back at my garden. Then I saw, standing among the rows, my walker. I gasped. I had walked without it, and I haven't needed it since. The doctor, believing that a cheerful mental outlook was as important to his patient as the actual medicine, instructed the nurse to seek ways to keep a pleasant atmosphere in the sick room. One particular day seemed hopeless as far as carrying out doctor's orders were concerned. The patient had been sullen and withdrawn most of his waking hours. Thinking to turn his mind away from himself, the nurse asked him that evening to recount his blessings. She was not surprised at his answer. "I don't have one thing for which to be thankful," he told her, "and you wouldn't either if you knew all the mean things I've been thinking about you today." The nurse's eyes twinkled. "Well, aren't you thankful you didn't say those mean things out loud?" Her good-natured chuckle brought an answering one from the patient, and that made yet another thing for which to be thankful. He could still laugh. Since I started for the kingdom, since my life he controls, since I gave my heart to Jesus, the longer I serve him, the sweeter he grows. The longer I serve him, the sweeter he grows. The more that I love him, more love he bestows. Each day is like heaven, my heart overflows. The longer I serve him, the sweeter he grows. Every need he is supplying, plenteous grace he bestows. Every day my way gets brighter, the longer I serve him, the sweeter he grows. The longer I serve him, the sweeter he grows. The more that I love him, more love he bestows. Each day is like heaven, my heart overflows. The longer I serve him, the sweeter he grows. I once received a letter from the President of the United States requesting my personal assistance with problems our country was having with some hostile foreign powers. I was notified to report to my draft board immediately after graduation from Emmanuel Missionary College, the forerunner of Andrews University, then a small freshwater college. By circumstances not of my doing, I ended up in the United States Navy for the duration of World War II and for as long thereafter as the President deemed necessary. In my case, 4 years. Through other circumstances, I became an officer. After a stint in the Marshall Islands, I was put aboard ship to participate in the assault on Palau. The passage to Palau lasted more than 2 months, with several stops along the way. Contrary to the military adage, never volunteer for anything, I volunteered for everything. I stood night watches, did star sightings and navigation, broke down encoded messages, and generally made myself useful. I had no ulterior motives. I figured being busy was better than wasting time, which is what much of war is. When the USS Cliff Rose reached Palau, we learned that our intelligence was wrong, an occasional military shortcoming. The anti-submarine installation I had been trained to install was no longer needed. The commanding officer asked that I be assigned temporary duty on board. Preferring busyness to idleness, I continued to make myself more informed and useful. After a few months, I was assigned to permanent duty on the ship, and in time I became the executive officer. More time and more invasions later, I became the commanding officer. This occurred in Saipan immediately after the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. My first and immediate orders were to return to Okinawa, take on a load of ground tackle consisting of anchors, chain, cable, buoys, and 7-ton clumps of concrete, and proceed to Japan. My assignment was to be a task unit commander to sweep and chart the 125 miles of the inland sea of Japan from the ocean of Hiroshima, and Kure, making it safe for the occupation forces that would follow. Our job was to establish sea lanes, clear mines, install navigational aids, and reconcile our American charts with the ones used by the Japanese. As we left Saipan, I radioed for information about the weather we'd likely to encounter. The forecast called for rain. It was the first time we'd sail alone without a convoy of ships and someone else issuing the battle group's orders. I now had 6 officers and some scores of men who were depending on me to be equal to any situation. We set out under heavy winds, which continued to worsen. 24 hours into our passage, I received word that a typhoon was forming and that I should take all reasonable precautions. I knew nothing of weather conditions in a typhoon, which is on land is called a hurricane. I had a book in my stateroom entitled The Complete Navigator. I studied its pages with a vigor I had never known in college, where I was in the half of the class that made the upper class possible. A typhoon is a huge system of winds moving in the northern hemisphere counterclockwise, usually hundreds of miles in diameter. In the center is an eye of calm. You can tell where you are in relation to the storm by observing the wind direction. If the wind is from the east, you're north of the storm. From the south, you're east of the storm. Mr. Bowditch, who wrote The Complete Navigator, said that the storm could be divided down the middle. Those to the left, with winds northeast, north, or northwest, were in the navigable semicircle. Those to the right were in the unnavigable semicircle. Those to the southeast were in the danger squadron, and those in the northeast were in the most dangerous squadron. We were in the northeast. The book explained safety measures for a ship's location in the first 3 quadrants. Our location in relation to the typhoon had put one suggestion: we should put the wind 2 points on our starboard bow and hope for the best. This meant turning nearly a half circle and facing south with the wind hitting us just to the right of the prow. It was good information, but executing it was another thing. By this time, the waves were crashing over the ship. On the bridge, 28 feet above level, black water was breaking on us from 40 or more feet above. Every time the ship shuddered, so did I. Heightening my terror was the fact that a few weeks earlier, 3 destroyers in a similar situation in the Coral Sea had endeavored to turn, foundered, and sunk, with more than 800 men lost. Destroyers had 3 huge propellers and a lot of horsepower. We had only 1 propeller. It was 11 feet in diameter, but the power was minimal in comparison to that of a destroyer's. Deep darkness was upon us, and without a miracle, there was no way we could survive the night. I repaired to my stateroom, not to study, but to pray. I am not a hero. My heart was pounding in my throat. After 2 years in the forward area of the war, my crew and I were pretty much inured to the possibility that we might not survive. But upon me was the total burden of responsibility for us to survive this storm. All the hope of the crew was in me, and I was frightened beyond words. I prayed that I would act beyond my ability and that my men would be saved. I announced that we would make the 180-degree turn at 9:25 p.m. I could feel the 20-plus tons of ship tremble as it was pounded by the angry waves. I continued in prayer until about 9:22, then went to the bridge. Thoughts of peace be still and faith of a grain of mustard seed went through my mind. The engine room was ready to supply full power and the flank speed at the appointed time. At 9:24 and 9:24:30, the sea threw its worst at us. At the stroke of 9:25, I gave order for hard left rudder and maximum power. At that instant, the sea flattened out like a mill pond, comparatively. A ship of that size and power takes 5 to 8 minutes to make that kind of turn. When the turn was complete, the sea instantly resumed its fury. A silent, "Thank you, dear God," went heavenward. We knew that nothing but God's mighty and righteous arm had intervened in our behalf. We didn't experience the calm of the storm's eye. It was west of us, leaving us to ride out the worst of the typhoon's violence. The wind was more than 125 miles an hour, the speed at which the measuring device instructed. Our radar would not turn in the face of the winds. 17 other ships were lost between Saipan and Okinawa, leaving few survivors. The passing of leadership from one commanding officer to his successor involves the lowering of the new stars and stripes that were hoisted that morning and giving the flag to the departing commander. The quartermaster then hoists a brand new flag to formalize the occasion. That new flag I received was of the best and most durable material. After the storm, it was merely a canvas strip with a few grommets and 4 6-inch threads. The wind had whipped away the entire 5-foot length of it. That experience and many others over the years taught me that God is always nearby. He's in charge, and He hears our prayers over the noise of the mightiest storms. No extremity is too great. No one is too far from being just a prayer away from Him. Thank God for that. The old homeless man stood on the corner of a sidewalk in Greenwich Village in New York City. Among the used magazines, tattered clothing, and odds and ends he spread out to sell, A small plaque caught my eye. Jesus is the head of my house. The message was spelled out in silver on someone had glued on a 5 by 7 inch scrap of cardboard and then decorated with cutouts of strawberry pattern wallpaper. The glass was dirty. The gray paint on the wooden frame was flaking. Maybe the old man had made it himself. Is $2 all right? I asked, fishing in my purse. He nodded. I gave him the money and tucked the plaque in the diaper bag slung over the back of the stroller where my son slept. Then I hurried home. Even after I cleaned the glass and wiped the frame with a damp cloth, the plaque was dingy. So I hung it on a hook in our bedroom closet where it played peekaboo through the hangers. As the years passed and our children grew, the old plaque moved with us from our first apartment in Horatio Street across town to our co-op on East 11th Street, where I hung it on a small nail above the laundry tub. Then my husband Tom and I decided to move to the suburbs where raising our children would be easier and less expensive. But caught in the Manhattan real estate crash, we were unable to sell our co-op, even at a huge loss. So we rented a rundown house in Connecticut, and the plaque went on a cobwebby windowsill in the cellar. One winter's day, I found it face up on the linoleum floor, its glass broken into shards. Jesus is the head of my family, illuminated by the harsh glare of a naked bulb. The words seemed to mock me. What house? I wondered. I hated the place we were renting. Cold in the winter, buggy in the summer. It bore the scars of tenant neglect. The harvest gold paint on the outside was peeling, and the avocado green shutters were rotting. Tom's family had mailed us a handsome personalized doormat for a housewarming present, but I couldn't bring myself to put it out. This was not our home. I was ashamed to welcome my guests more times than I cared to admit. I'd picked up the phone and to ask someone over for coffee or supper and changed my mind at the last minute. Sometimes I felt guilty for being unhappy. After all, we had much to be thankful for. We had found a good church. Our children, Katie and Sprink, were thriving at their new elementary school and making new friends. They relished the freedom of a backyard and loved riding their bikes up and down the block. Tom didn't even mind the hour-plus commute on the train. We enjoyed the slower pace of life, the sound of wind in the trees, the red flash of a cardinal, or the sight of deer nibbling at the rhododendron bushes. Now I looked at the broken plaque lying on the basement floor. Gingerly, I picked up a splinter of glass and tossed it into a plastic pail. I reached for another shard and tossed it, then another. Finally, the glass was gone, but the framed message was still there. Jesus is the head of my house. And I got the message at last. It was as though someone spoke the words with a forcefulness that oh, excuse me. I think the pollen season is on us. And I got the message at last. It was as though someone spoke the words with a forcefulness that jolted me out of my skin. Of course, my house was not this leaky, creaky structure built on top of dreary concrete blocks. My house was not our unsold co-op in the city. Or would it be the suburban colonial we dreamed of buying someday? My house is my heart. Every day I had the privilege of inviting Jesus to be the head, filling me with his hope, encouragement, guidance, and love. My fingers traced the silver letters. Jesus hadn't been the head of my house for a long time. Lord, I prayed, I'm so sorry I've shut you out. Please come into my heart and be the head of my house. I returned the plaque to its spot on the windowsill. Turning to go, I noticed a pile of boxes stacked under this basement stairwell. It took some rummaging, but I found what I was looking for. Running upstairs, I opened the front door and rolled out the doormat. The Slattery's, it said. Would we ever sell our co-op? Would we ever own a home again? Somehow, those questions didn't seem to matter as much anymore. I headed to the kitchen to phone a friend from church and invite her over for coffee. I was ready to be welcoming. Thanks to a homeless man, I knew where my home was and to whom it belonged. On a muggy summer evening in New York City, my sister and I were bicycling along the Hudson River when she suggested we stop at one of the piers to watch the sunset. What? I asked. Look at a sunset from here? The pier seemed an unlikely spot for which to view anything. Abandoned and littered, jutting out into the murky waters of the Hudson, it pointed west toward the smokestacks of the New Jersey shoreline. Come on, my sister called, follow me. We pedaled onto the blacktop pier. A little crowd had gathered there. Some sat quietly on old pilings, others ventured to the river's edge. Finding places on the broken concrete breakwater, we were all looking to the west, waiting. Soundlessly, the great sun edged its way toward the horizon, bathing land and sky in one rosy-colored light. Spellbound, we watched in silence as the sun sank behind the skyline of the distant shore until only a thin crescent remained. Finally, that too disappeared. Not one of us on that pier moved. Not a word was said. For a moment, we remained in the thrall of something so pure, so majestic, that it could only come from God. And then, as one, we burst into spontaneous applause. Some retired people worry about having too much time on their hands. Not me. Bea and I bought a lakeside home in rural Kansas. It's peaceful and lovely. We bought a boat and I go fishing, but there's always work to do. A house project or something that needs fixing. One January afternoon, while Bea baked a loaf of banana bread, I headed out to tackle a chore I'd been putting off, cleaning the garage. I was straightening some tools when something caught my eye outside the window. Was it just a reflection off the ice-colored lake? I squinted through the sun. I turned away, then looked again. Bea, I shouted, someone's fallen through the ice. He was about 100 feet out. For 25 years, I'd worked as a highway trooper. Maybe I was retired, but I still knew what I had to do. I grabbed my coat and a long coil of rope off the wall and raced across her yard. As I got closer, I realized the struggling figure was a neighbor down the way, John. He wasn't alone. Huddled a few yards farther out on the ice was his poodle Checkers, terrified. Checkers must have wandered out onto the ice, I thought, and John must have run out to rescue him. Now I could see more clearly. John was way out there in the freezing water, clinging to a buoy. No way my rope will stretch that far, I thought. Bea, call 911, I yelled back to the house where Bea was standing in the doorway. In this weather, it wouldn't take long for hypothermia to do John in. It would take the police at least 20 minutes to get there. Too late. I was the only trooper nearby. It was up to me. I looked around and spotted a log by the edge of the lake. Maybe if I tie the rope to it, it will give me enough length to reach him. I fumbled in the cold, finally made a knot, and then got ready to toss the rope. I sure hope I have the strength to throw it, and John has the strength to grab it. I heaved the rope as far as I could. Not far enough. I looked around again, frantic. Nobody home next door, but tied to the end of their dock, which jutted 40 feet out into the water, was a canoe. I raced down the dock, pulled out a pocket knife, and sawed away at the waterproof line that secured it. I pushed the canoe out onto the ice, threw the coil of rope into the canoe, and stepped carefully behind the boat. The ice was solid near shore, so I wasn't afraid of falling through, but it grew dangerously thin out by John. "Be careful, Henry," Bee called out. There was real fear in her voice. With each step, I felt the ice give a little more, like a mattress. I was shivering like crazy. About 70 feet out, I had to stop. Any farther and I'd fall through a tube. I climbed into the canoe and stepped as gingerly as possible toward the far end. I was close enough to John to get a good look at his face. It worried me. His hands, still clutching the buoy, were red and swollen. His eyes looked glazed. Checkers lay still on the ice, whimpering. "John," I shouted, trying to rouse him, "are you ready to catch the rope?" Barely. He just managed to nod his head. He was almost gone. Any second now, his grip on the buoy would fail and he'd slip under the water for good. I drew my arm back and flung the coil of rope like a discus thrower. Still not far enough. I hauled it back in and coiled it again. This time I said a quick prayer. "Lord, lend me the strength I don't have." I threw the rope with all my might. Bullseye, it landed a foot from him. "Let go of the buoy and grab the rope," I yelled. John thrashed in the water. For an instant I thought he would go down. He reached out once more and got it. I let out a sigh. The hard part's over, I thought. I spotted Checkers alone now on the ice. I'd have to come back for her. I stood in the canoe and tried to haul John out of the water, but I couldn't. He kept falling through. I didn't know how much longer he could stay conscious. "Pull, John," I silently prayed. "Pull." With the last of his strength, John gripped the rope. He yanked so hard that, to my horror, the canoe began drifting back onto the ice toward him. If the canoe breaks through the ice, I thought, I'll flip over and trying to save him. We were halfway back to the dock. "Lord, don't let me lose him now." I looked down at my feet. Half the coil of rope was back in the boat. I turned to Bee, who was watching from shore. "Go to the end of the dock," I shouted. I flung the rope to her. "Tie it to the end of the dock." I pulled as hard as I could. I dragged him to the edge of the ice, but I couldn't lift him onto the frozen surface. His weight was too much. He fell back into the frigid water, his head submerged until I could yank him up again. He's been in the water at least 10 minutes, I thought. He won't last much longer. I reached back and grabbed the end of the rope, which Bee had tied to the dock, and tugged with all my might. Inch by inch, the canoe crept back toward safety. I looked down at John. He was fading fast. "Pull, Henry, pull," I told myself. With a final effort, we reached the dock. John's eyes were shut. "Stay with me, John." I grabbed him by the chest and hauled him onto the dock. I lay there for an instant, so exhausted I could barely speak. John, lying next to me, was passed out. The police rescue team arrived a minute later. They wrapped John in blankets and raced him to the hospital. He was going to be okay. The police chief paddled the canoe through the break John and I had made in the ice and grabbed Checkers. She passed out too, but she would be fine. The rescue team finally left. Bee and I trudged back to our house. I peeled off my coat and sank into the nearest chair. The banana bread was done. Bee gave me a slice and took my hand. "Henry, you were a real trooper today. You saved John's life," she said. "Retirement or no retirement, you never know when the Lord's going to call on you. In that sense, I guess, I'm always on duty, and I don't mind a bit." Every spring, my husband Morton and I travel from LA to visit our family in the South. But last January, he wasn't feeling up to a long plane ride, even though we had accumulated enough frequent flyer miles for free round-trip tickets. "You go," Marty said. "Enjoy. I can take care of myself." In our 40 years together, I had never taken a trip without him. I called him every night from my niece's house in Nashville. Then one morning, as I was about to leave for the airport, we got news. that an earthquake had hit LA at 5:31 a.m. Frantically, I tried to get through to Morty. God, I asked angrily, why didn't you nudge me to stay home with him? We would have been together, sleeping side by side when the earthquake struck. Instead, Morty had to fend for himself. I finally reached my son, who assured me that Morty was fine. When I got home, I was never so happy to see him. It didn't matter that almost everything in our apartment was destroyed. The dishwasher had been torn loose and flung through the kitchen wall. In the bedroom, broken bottles, picture frames, and mirrors covered the floor. The highboy was overturned. My eyes darted to the bed where Marty had been safe amid the mayhem. I thanked God for watching over him. And then I stared, unbelieving, at our 19-inch, 50-pound TV set. It had been thrown from the top of the highboy onto the bed and landed exactly on the spot where I would have been sleeping if I had stayed home. Sometimes when I get halfway through telling about how God put his signature on my uncle's corn crop, a few people get a kind of skeptical look on their faces. This uncle, Roger H. Geisbert, had a small farm in Frederick County, Maryland. Back in 1964, he was about 76 at the time. A fierce drought killed his hay, barley, and wheat crops. He was desperate to save the corn so he could feed his little herd of purebred milking shorthorn cattle. The corn stalks were firing, drying clear up to the tassel. And when he saw that, Uncle Roger dropped to his knees right there in the cornfield and asked God to send rain. When he finished praying, he said, "Now, God, show me you heard my prayer." Then he got up and walked back toward the house. Before he even got to the porch, a beautiful, freshening rain was falling out of a sky that was nearly cloudless. And the very next day, there was a heavy, soaking rain, enough to grain out the ears of corn. Uncle Roger knelt and thanked God for answering his prayer. Coincidence? Maybe, but wait until you hear the rest of the story. Uncle Roger's crop matured very nicely. He tied the bucks, and as the corn ripened, he went to cutting it and then to shucking. He was nearly finished, and he almost tossed it onto the pile without noticing, when he found the sign from God that he'd requested. It is an object that he later had framed and that I treasure to this day. A beautiful ear of corn, all golden kernels, except for the scarlet ones, forming a perfect cross. But that still leaves the question, who washed Jesus' feet?